Bank refuses to serve man in Kamala Harris hat, then learns he owns the bank. The fluorescent lights of the airport terminal flickered overhead as the usual mix of passengers bustled about, preparing for their flights. The sound of rolling luggage wheels echoed across the polished floor, blending with the soft murmur of announcements over the loudspeaker. It was a typical Thursday morning at Westview International Airport, nothing out of the ordinary. That is, until Mark Thompson, a man in his mid-40s, stepped into the terminal. He moved with the same calm confidence he'd had for years, dressed simply in a navy blue jacket and a worn Harris Walls cap. But to anyone observing, his hat was an eyesore. It stood out in a sea of travel-worn passengers who were absorbed in their own routines. Mark's hat was his silent political statement. Some might have seen it as harmless, even supportive, but to others, it represented everything they disliked. One person who couldn't ignore the sight of it was Caitlin Harris, a flight attendant at Westview Airlines. Caitlin was tall, with striking features, always impeccably put together in her uniform. She was no stranger to dealing with difficult passengers, but Mark's hat stirred something in her, something visceral. As she watched him walk toward the gate, she felt a tightening in her chest, a sense of offense she couldn't fully articulate. To her, the hat was a symbol. She had been outspoken about her political beliefs, and she firmly believed that certain views had no place in the environment of a public space like an airport. The plane, especially, was a place that should be free from tension and division. So, when Mark made his way to the gate and took his seat, Caitlin's discomfort grew. The man was quiet, relaxed, not causing any disturbances. But in her mind, the message his hat sent was louder than any conversation. She couldn't let it slide. It was more than just a personal discomfort. To Caitlin, it was a line she couldn't ignore. As Caitlin moved through the terminal, preparing for the upcoming flight, she noticed Mark sitting calmly, waiting. He was absorbed in his phone, oblivious to the stirring thoughts inside her. Caitlin stopped by the boarding desk, her eyes darting to Mark as she shared a quiet exchange with the supervisor. There was no doubt in her mind that something had to be done. It was a matter of principle. Caitlin wasn't new to handling confrontations on the job. She had dealt with irate passengers before, oversold flights, delays, and even emergencies. But this felt different. It wasn't the usual chaos she was used to. This felt personal. She had been in this airport for years, knew its rhythm, and every part of her professional being told her that a passenger like Mark had no place on her plane. Her hands gripped the corner of the desk, and she mentally prepared herself for the task at hand. As much as she hated conflict, as much as she wanted to keep the peace, her values demanded action. "Excuse me, sir," Caitlin said as she approached Mark's seat, her voice clear and authoritative. Her posture was straight, but her eyes showed the first flickers of tension. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove that hat before boarding the plane. It's against our airline's policy to wear political statements on board." Mark looked up, his eyes briefly widening in surprise. His gaze quickly shifted to her uniform, then back to her face. He wasn't used to being told what to do, especially not in a public space like an airport. He had been wearing that hat for weeks with no issue. But here, with Caitlin's sharp eyes watching him, something felt different. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone polite but confused. "What's the issue with the hat?" Caitlin stood firm, her arms crossed now. "It's a political symbol, and we don't allow anything that could potentially cause disruption or make other passengers uncomfortable. Please remove it or I'll have to ask you to leave the terminal." Mark's brow furrowed. He glanced down at the hat, a simple yet powerful symbol in Caitlin's eyes, but one he hadn't thought twice about when putting it on. "It's just a hat," he said. "It's not hurting anyone. I'm afraid you'll have to comply with the rules," Caitlin replied, her voice tight, the edges of frustration beginning to show. She was no stranger to pushing passengers into compliance, but something about Mark's demeanor unsettled her. He wasn't responding with the usual anger or defiance. Instead, he was calm, almost too calm, like he was aware of something she wasn't. Mark stared at her for a moment, sensing the rising tension in the air. He knew what was coming. "Are you seriously asking me to take it off?" he asked, the disbelief clear in his voice. "Yes," Caitlin responded firmly, stepping closer, or you'll be removed from the flight." Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He simply stood up, a small shake of his head, as he placed the hat down on his seat. "Fine, I'll take it off," he said, voice low, but it wasn't an apology. He wasn't backing down. He was complying, but it was clear he felt the weight of the situation. Caitlin's pulse quickened. She had won the battle, but she hadn't yet won the war. She had forced him to comply, but she could sense the quiet tension that lingered. Something about this encounter felt unfinished, unresolved. She had humiliated him in front of the other passengers, and as she looked at the faces of the people nearby, she wondered if any of them shared her discomfort about the hat. She had done the right thing, right? Or had she? As she walked away from him, she glanced back one last time. Mark was sitting down, the hat now resting in his lap. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he sat that made Caitlin uneasy. He wasn't upset, but he wasn't apologetic either. She had expected some sort of backlash, some kind of verbal exchange, but he said nothing. He just stared ahead, quiet and composed. It made her wonder, who was this man really? Was she sure about her actions? Had she really made the right decision? The doubt that had started to creep into her mind grew, but she pushed it aside. She had a job to do. She had a duty to the passengers, and no matter what, she wouldn't let herself second-guess that. Caitlin's focus wavered for just a moment, and when she turned back to the gate, the realization hit her like a truck. The man she had just thrown off the plane wasn't just some random passenger. He was the owner of the airline, the leader of the company, the one who could make all her actions come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But she didn't know that yet. She would soon, but for now it felt like the calm before a storm. She had no idea that her moment of decision, of enforcing her personal beliefs in a public space, was going to change her life forever. The next few minutes felt like a blur for Caitlin as she continued preparing for the flight. Her hands moved automatically, checking the passenger list, confirming boarding passes, and making sure the crew was ready. But her mind kept returning to Mark, the man she had just kicked off the flight for wearing the Kamala Harris hat. A feeling of unease gnawed at her as she reflected on the interaction. Was she too harsh? Was it really her place to make a snap judgment about someone based solely on a hat? She shook her head, pushing the thought away. She had done what she thought was right, and no amount of second-guessing was going to change that now. Still, as she moved through the terminal, Caitlin couldn't shake the image of Mark sitting there quietly, watching her as she issued the command for him to leave. His calm demeanor had only made her more certain that she was in control. But the moment she had turned away, something deep inside her told her that there was more to him than she had realized. It was a subtle feeling, one that she couldn't quite place, but it was there, just beneath the surface. A gut feeling that told her she hadn't seen the whole picture. The moments dragged on. The boarding process was typical. Passengers filed into the gate area, each of them eager to board the flight. But Caitlin couldn't help but glance at the door every now and then, half expecting to see Mark reappear, demanding to speak to someone in charge. Her mind raced as she tried to focus on her duties. Her colleagues spoke with a calm familiarity, the usual airport routine in full swing, but Caitlin's focus was fractured. As she looked around the terminal, she noticed a few people glancing her way, as though they were waiting for something. It made her uneasy. Were they talking about what had just happened? Was Mark making a scene? She hadn't heard any commotion, but the thought lingered in her mind. The boarding announcement came through, and Caitlin snapped back into focus. Her duties came first, and she had no time to entertain doubts. She made the final checks on the flight manifest and confirmed with the gate staff that everything was in order. The flight was ready to depart, and she would have to put the incident out of her mind for now. The passengers were starting to board, and there was no room for distractions. But just as Caitlin was about to step forward to begin the final process of boarding, she saw someone coming down the hallway. It was Mark. He wasn't walking with a hurried pace, nor was he agitated. He was calm, collected, and purposeful. He wasn't holding the hat anymore, but there was no mistaking him. He was headed straight toward her. Caitlin felt her heart skip a beat. She had expected him to walk away, to just let it go. But now here he was. The unease she had tried to ignore rushed back in full force. She stood frozen for a moment as he closed the distance between them. What did he want? Was he going to cause a scene? Was he going to make her regret the decision she had made? Her mind raced, but she couldn't back down now. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice calm but with an edge of authority that took Caitlin off guard. "I need to speak with you." Caitlin's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't help but feel a mixture of dread and defiance. "I'm busy," she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please, I don't have time for this." Mark didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or show any signs of aggression. Instead, he simply took a step closer, his calm gaze fixed on her. "It won't take long," he said, his voice steady, almost reassuring. She stood her ground, but she couldn't deny that something in the way he carried himself made her uneasy. She could feel the weight of his presence, and it made her feel small. She was in charge here, wasn't she? She was the one with the authority, not him. "I said I don't have time for this," Caitlin repeated, her voice more forceful now. "I've already asked you to leave. Please respect my decision." Mark smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a calculated one, as though he knew something that Caitlin didn't. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I think you misunderstand," he said softly. "I'm not the one who needs to leave, but you might be." Caitlin's heart stopped for a moment. What was he implying? She looked at him, trying to read his face, but it was impossible to gauge what he was thinking. There was something unsettling about his confidence. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that she was in the right. But now, standing face to face with him again, she was starting to feel like maybe she had made a mistake. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her words coming out more shakily than she had intended. She took a step back, trying to maintain her composure. "This is ridiculous. You need to leave. Now." Mark didn't move. He simply watched her, his gaze never wavering. "I think it's time you realize who you're talking to," he said, his tone softening, almost mockingly. "I'm the one who owns this airline, Caitlin." The words hit Caitlin like a slap in the face. Her stomach dropped, her thoughts frozen in shock. The owner? The man she had kicked off the plane, the one she had dismissed so easily. He was the owner of the entire airline? She struggled to find her voice, but for a moment, nothing came out. "You own the airline," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling with disbelief. She could feel the blood draining from her face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "You're the owner?" Mark's smile remained, but there was no warmth behind it. "Yes, Caitlin, I'm the owner, and you've just made a very big mistake." Caitlin's mind raced. The man she had dismissed, the man she had humiliated in front of other passengers, was not just anyone. He was the one who could make or break her career. And now, with his revelation, she realized just how badly she had miscalculated. It wasn't just about a hat. It wasn't just about politics. It was about respect, and she had shown him none. For a moment, Caitlin stood there, frozen, staring at Mark. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing she could say that would undo what had been done. And as she stood there, realizing the weight of her mistake, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The consequences were only starting, and she had no idea just how much they would cost her. Caitlin watched Mark's calm, unwavering presence as he stood in the boarding area. The shock of his statement, that he was the owner of the airline, had rattled her more than she wanted to admit, but she couldn't afford to lose her composure now. If he really was who he claimed to be, there had to be some sort of verification, right? He couldn't just say it and expect her to believe him. Still, there was something about the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but commanded respect, that made her doubt herself. She tried to push the thought away, focusing instead on the task at hand, maintaining control. The passengers were still boarding, oblivious to the tension simmering near the gate, and Caitlin was determined not to let this turn into a spectacle. "Sir," Caitlin said, her voice sharper now as she stepped closer to Mark, "I don't have time for games. If you don't leave the boarding area immediately, I will have no choice but to call security. Mark raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. By all means, call them, he said, his voice smooth and unbothered. I'd be happy to clarify the situation with them. Caitlin hesitated, her hand hovering over the walkie-talkie clipped to her uniform. The last thing she wanted was to escalate the situation further, especially with passengers nearby. But she couldn't let him stay there, defying her authority, challenging her in front of everyone. She needed to assert control before things spiraled out of hand. With a sharp inhale, Caitlin pressed the button on her walkie-talkie and called for airport security. We have a situation at Gate 12, she said, her tone firm. A passenger is refusing to comply with boarding instructions. I need assistance immediately. Mark remained unfazed, his arms casually crossed as he watched her. The tension in the air was palpable, but he didn't seem the least bit concerned. Caitlin couldn't understand it. Most people would be flustered, defensive, or at least annoyed by now. But Mark stood there like he had nothing to lose, like he knew something she didn't. Within moments, 2 security guards arrived, their presence immediately drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Caitlin gestured toward Mark, her posture stiff with determination. This man has been causing a disturbance and refusing to comply with airline policies, she explained, her voice loud enough for others to hear. He needs to be escorted out of the terminal. The guards exchanged a glance before turning their attention to Mark. One of them, a stocky man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave the boarding area, he said, his tone firm but polite. Mark tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Of course, he said, his voice steady. But before we go any further, I'd like to see the policy I violated. The guard hesitated, glancing back at Caitlin for clarification. Caitlin felt a surge of frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to comply, to back down, not turn the situation into a debate. It's standard policy, Caitlin interjected, her tone sharp. No political statements or clothing that could incite conflict or discomfort among passengers. Mark's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Interesting, he said, his voice calm but pointed. I've traveled with this airline countless times and never encountered such a policy before. Perhaps you can show me where it's written. Caitlin's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected him to push back like this, and she certainly didn't have the documentation to back up her claim. It wasn't an official policy, just an unwritten rule she had decided to enforce in the moment. But now, under Mark's scrutiny, it was starting to unravel. Before she could respond, the second security guard, a younger man with a more hesitant demeanor, spoke up. Sir, if you'd like to file a complaint, you can do so through the proper channels. For now, we just need you to step away from the gate. Mark nodded, his expression calm. I appreciate your professionalism, he said to the younger guard, but I'd like to clarify something before I leave. He turned back to Caitlin, his gaze steady. You've made an assumption about me based on what I'm wearing. You've decided that I'm a threat to your passengers' comfort, without any evidence to support that claim. Is that correct? Caitlin bristled, her face flushing with anger. I made a judgment call, she snapped, and it's my job to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone on this flight. Mark raised an eyebrow. Interesting choice of words, he said, his tone cool. Because it seems to me that your judgment was based on nothing more than your own biases. The words hit Caitlin like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The tension in the air was thick, the stares of nearby passengers making her feel like she was under a spotlight. She could see the faint smirks and curious glances from people who were clearly intrigued by the unfolding drama. The older security guard stepped forward again, his patience clearly wearing thin. Sir, we need to resolve this now, he said firmly. Are you willing to leave the terminal peacefully? Mark's smile widened slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I'm more than willing to comply, he said. But I think it's important that we all understand what's happening here. Because this isn't about a hat. It's about how we treat people. Caitlin felt her composure slipping. She had been so confident, so certain that she was in control. But now, with Mark calmly dismantling her authority, she felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. She couldn't let him win. Not like this. Enough of this, she snapped, her voice rising. You're disrupting the boarding process, and I won't tolerate it any longer. Either leave now, or I'll have you forcibly removed. Mark held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Very well, he said. If that's how you want to handle it. He turned to the guards, his demeanor still calm. Gentlemen, lead the way. As the guards escorted him away from the gate, Caitlin felt a brief surge of relief. Finally, the situation was under control. But as she watched Mark disappear down the corridor, a nagging feeling of unease remained. Something about the way he had handled himself, the quiet confidence he exuded, made her feel like this wasn't over. And deep down, she knew she was right. The walk back to the terminal desk felt long and exhausting, every step a reminder of how much she had just lost. Caitlin didn't bother to look over her shoulder to see if Mark had turned around to look back at her. She was certain he hadn't. The man had acted like it didn't matter, like he was in full control of the situation. And yet, here she was, still fighting the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Once she reached the counter, Caitlin took a deep breath, hoping to steady her nerves. She glanced at the clock on the wall. There was still time before boarding began. She had a few minutes to breathe, to let the tension in her shoulders ease just a little. She looked around the terminal, noticing that the usual chatter and movement of passengers felt distant, like she was in some bubble of quiet, cut off from the world around her. But that was only a temporary reprieve. She couldn't stay here forever. Her mind kept returning to Mark. Who was he really? He hadn't acted like just another passenger. She hadn't been able to put her finger on it before, but now the memory of his calm, collected response was stuck in her mind. He hadn't reacted like someone who was being wronged. He hadn't gotten upset, had never tried to escalate the situation. Instead, he had stood there, in control the entire time, watching her without a hint of worry in his eyes. Maybe it was because she knew she'd made a mistake, and it was eating away at her. The fact that she had dismissed him because of a simple hat, because of something as trivial as a political statement, made her stomach churn. But it wasn't just that. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that she had the right to judge him, that she had the moral high ground. And now she had doubts. What if she had misunderstood everything? What if, by trying to uphold some unwritten rule about comfort, she had crossed a line? Her hands rested on the counter, her knuckles white. She didn't know what the consequences would be. She couldn't even guess what Mark might do next. The power dynamics had shifted so quickly, so unexpectedly, that she couldn't help but feel like she had lost. But how? She didn't even know the full extent of his involvement here. She had thought he was just a passenger, someone she could manage with ease. But now she felt like she had been playing a game with rules she didn't understand. The minutes ticked by, and soon enough, it was time to board the plane. Caitlin's eyes moved mechanically over the paperwork, the boarding passes, and the usual pre-flight checks. But even as she moved through her tasks, her thoughts remained elsewhere, on the situation with Mark. Her mind refused to quiet down, to push him out of her thoughts. She had to resolve this. But how? What if he decided to make her life difficult? What if he filed a complaint, got her removed from her position? The more she thought about it, the more her gut twisted. She knew that her actions hadn't just been about enforcing the no political statements rule. Deep down, she had let her own biases dictate how she acted. And now that she had been forced to face the reality of her mistake, she felt small, insignificant. A thought crossed her mind. What if this was a test? What if Mark had been watching her the entire time, waiting for her to make a mistake? She shook the thought away. No, that was ridiculous. He was just another person trying to board a plane. But the more she reflected, the more it seemed like the stakes were higher than she had imagined. The doors to the gate opened, and passengers started to trickle in. Caitlin's attention snapped back to her duties, but she couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. Every few moments, her gaze wandered to the back of the terminal, half expecting to see Mark walking back through the door. But the minutes passed, and there was no sign of him. Maybe, just maybe, he had dropped the issue and moved on. That would have been the smart thing to do, wouldn't it? Just walk away. But she couldn't help but wonder if he was simply biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike back. As Caitlin helped passengers onto the plane, her mind kept replaying the exchange. She couldn't get over the fact that he hadn't argued, hadn't yelled or caused a scene. He had simply accepted what she'd said, even though she had humiliated him in front of everyone. The power of that moment had completely shifted. He had given her no ammunition, no chance to defend her actions. It was as though he had known that his silence would be enough. She turned away from the boarding process for a brief moment to collect her thoughts. Her shift was almost over, and she could finally take a breath. But there was no relief. Instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. What if he came back? What if he was waiting for her outside the terminal? What if she lost her job over this? Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for the clipboard. She had to keep it together. She had to stay calm, focus on the task at hand. But her thoughts refused to quiet. She kept waiting for the moment when the inevitable consequence would arrive, when Mark would come to make her regret everything she'd done. It wasn't until the last passenger had boarded and Caitlin was about to head toward the cockpit for final checks that she saw him. Mark, standing in the doorway of the terminal, his face unreadable. His posture was calm, relaxed, but there was no mistaking the sharpness in his eyes. He wasn't just some random traveler, and she wasn't about to get away with what had just transpired. For a moment, Caitlin froze, her mind scrambling for a way out, for something to say, something to fix this. But as she made eye contact with Mark, she knew there was no turning back. Her worst fear had come true. She had underestimated him. She had let her biases cloud her judgment, and now the consequences were here. The owner of the airline was standing right in front of her, and she had no idea what would come next. As he walked toward her, she realized that this moment would change everything. The storm was coming, and she had no idea how it would unfold. Caitlin's heart pounded as Mark approached. Every step he took seemed to stretch the time, pulling it into an unbearable limbo. The terminal, the passengers, even the distant sound of overhead announcements began to fade into the background. All that mattered now was Mark. She had tried to convince herself that it was over, that the situation had been diffused. But as he neared, she could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her. There was no way out. She was stuck in this moment, forced to face the consequences of her rash decision. Mark's composed, almost detached demeanor only made things worse. He wasn't angry, wasn't shouting, wasn't demanding anything. He simply walked with purpose, as if he knew this was all a game and the outcome was already decided. Caitlin couldn't bring herself to look away. He stopped a few feet in front of her, his eyes steady, but there was something in them now, a quiet intensity that left her feeling exposed. "Is there something you need?" Caitlin managed, her voice shaky despite her attempt to sound composed. Mark took a slow breath, and his lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Caitlin felt a chill run down her spine. She had been expecting an argument, a shouting match, something loud and confrontational. Instead, Mark's calmness unsettled her. It was as though he was in complete control of the situation, even if she couldn't see how. He glanced at the boarding desk, then back at Caitlin. "No, not really," he said. His tone was casual, almost too casual. "I just thought we should talk." Talk. Caitlin's stomach twisted. She was already bracing herself for whatever was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for what he said next. "You know, I'm actually the one who owns this airline." His words hung in the air between them, heavy and deliberate. Caitlin blinked, struggling to process what he had just said. The blood drained from her face, and for a split second, her body went numb. Her eyes searched his face, trying to decipher whether he was joking, testing her, or if this was some sick reality she hadn't quite grasped. But the calm expression on his face told her everything. He wasn't lying. He owned the airline. The world seemed to shift under Caitlin's feet. The weight of her earlier actions hit her like a ton of bricks. The man she had just kicked off the flight, humiliated in front of others, was the person who controlled everything around her. The person she had dismissed, thought nothing of, was the very person who could end her career in a heartbeat. Caitlin's mouth went dry, and she fought to steady herself. You're the owner?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark nodded slowly, his gaze unblinking. "Yes, I'm the owner of the airline, and I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened." Caitlin felt a pang of panic. Her mind was scrambling, trying to think of something to say, something that could possibly make this situation less of a disaster. But there was nothing she could do now. She had overstepped, made a call she was far from qualified to make. And now, the person she had dismissed as a threat had revealed himself as the very person she could least afford to offend. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice cracking as she tried to explain. I thought you were causing a disturbance. I didn't mean to." Mark held up a hand, silencing her. "I understand," he said, his tone almost sympathetic, but there was no warmth behind it. "But the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you made an assumption about me, about my beliefs, based on nothing more than the hat I was wearing." His voice hardened, and the air between them seemed to thicken. "You didn't stop to consider the possibility that you were wrong." Caitlin's stomach churned as the realization of what she had done finally sank in. She had let her personal biases cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the price. She had judged Mark based on his outward appearance, assuming he was nothing more than a political agitator, when in reality he was the one in control. She had been wrong, and she had been reckless. "I didn't mean to make assumptions," Caitlin said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just thought." "Thought what?" Mark interrupted, his voice sharp. "That you could impose your own standards on me? That because I wear a hat you don't like, I should be treated differently?" Caitlin's silence was damning. There was no excuse she could offer that would make it better. No justification that would make her actions seem less cruel. She had acted out of her own prejudices, and now she had to face the consequences. Mark took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't get to make those decisions, Caitlin. You don't get to decide who belongs here or who doesn't, especially not based on something as trivial as a hat." His voice was low but carried an undeniable authority. "You've caused enough damage today, and I intend to make sure you understand that." Caitlin's knees wobbled slightly, and she reached for the counter to steady herself. She had worked hard to get where she was, climbing her way through the ranks to get a position that allowed her to stand in front of people, to lead. But all of that felt meaningless now. She had lost everything in a matter of minutes. Mark continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "I don't take these things lightly. You made a choice that could have affected not just my reputation, but the airline as a whole. You treated a customer like a criminal for nothing more than his appearance. You treated him like he didn't belong, and I'm not sure what's worse, the fact that you did it, or the fact that you thought you had every right to." His words cut deep. Caitlin could feel the anger and frustration rising inside her, but she had no way to fight back. He was right. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. "I'll make sure this gets documented," Mark added, his tone even, though his words carried the weight of finality. "And I'll be speaking with your superiors about this. We'll see if you're fit to continue in this role after what you've done." Caitlin swallowed hard, her throat closing up. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she stood there, taking the full brunt of her actions, knowing that whatever happened next, she couldn't undo the damage she had caused. And so, with that final statement, the reality of the situation sank in. Her career was hanging by a thread, and she had no one to blame but herself. The silence between Caitlin and Mark was almost suffocating. The bustling activity of the terminal, the usual hum of passengers moving about, felt miles away now. Every step Caitlin took felt like a burden. The heavy weight of her actions hung over her, suffocating her. Mark's presence before her was an undeniable reminder of her mistake, a mistake that had already begun to cost her more than she could have anticipated. Mark didn't say anything else for a moment, standing there, observing her quietly as though he were waiting for something. Maybe an apology, maybe some form of acknowledgement. But Caitlin had no words to offer him. She felt small, exposed under his unwavering gaze. There was no denying it now. She had made a grave error, and the consequences were quickly becoming more tangible than she could have imagined. Her mind raced as she tried to process everything. The weight of the situation was becoming clearer by the second. Mark had revealed that he was the owner of the airline, the very person who could end her career with a single phone call. Caitlin had thought she was in control, that she was merely enforcing a policy, but it was clear now that she had been playing a much larger game, one where the stakes were far higher than she had ever realized. Mark cleared his throat, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, controlled, but the words that followed were laced with a cold authority that sent a chill down Caitlin's spine. "I hope you understand the gravity of what's happened here, Caitlin," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your actions have consequences, and I intend to make sure that everyone understands just how serious this is." Caitlin stood there, unable to respond, her body stiff as if she were paralyzed by the weight of her own mistakes. The truth was, she did understand. She understood that she had crossed a line. She had misjudged Mark based on his appearance, his hat, and allowed her personal biases to dictate her actions. And now, the consequences were playing out before her. "I don't think you fully grasp the damage you've done," Mark continued, his voice even but firm. "You've disrespected me. You've disrespected the passengers and the entire company. And you've made it clear that you're willing to make decisions based on your personal feelings, without any regard for the bigger picture." Caitlin swallowed hard, her throat tight with regret. She had let her personal opinions cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the price. She could feel her career slipping through her fingers, the hard work she had put in to get to this point now feeling like it had been for nothing. She had allowed herself to get caught up in a moment of personal righteousness, and now she was being called out for it. Mark's expression remained neutral, but Caitlin could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't just angry at what had happened. He was angry at the larger implications of her actions. "You may think this is just about a hat, about enforcing a rule. But it's not," he said, his voice gaining an edge. "It's about respect. And you've shown me none. You've treated me as if I didn't belong here, as if my opinion didn't matter, just because of a political statement I'm wearing on my head. But the truth is, you don't get to decide who belongs. That's not your job." Caitlin's breath caught in her throat as his words landed. She had thought she was in the right. She had convinced herself that she was acting within her responsibilities. But now it was clear that she had made an enormous misstep. She was the one who didn't belong here, at least not in the way she had treated Mark. He was right. She didn't get to decide who belonged or who didn't, and her actions had been based on a narrow, judgmental perspective that had no place in the professional world. Mark's voice softened, but the underlying coldness was still there. "You know, Caitlin, I'm not one to act impulsively. I've dealt with much worse situations than this, but I'm not going to let this slide. Not this time. Not with you. You've crossed a line, and now you need to face the consequences." Caitlin could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. There was no getting out of this, no way to undo what she had done. She could feel the eyes of the surrounding passengers on her now, their attention drawn to the confrontation. Mark's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't stop thinking about them. "You've crossed a line." The weight of those words was almost suffocating. She had crossed a line, and there was no way back from it. She looked down at the ground, her shame evident in her posture. She couldn't look him in the eye anymore. "I'm sorry," she muttered, but the words felt hollow. There was no way to make it right now, no way to undo the damage. She had been so sure of herself, so confident in her authority. But now she was nothing more than a person who had failed. And that failure had come at the cost of her career, her dignity, and her place within the organization. Mark didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't done yet, Caitlin could tell. The silence between them stretched out, and she could feel the weight of it bearing down on her. He had the power here. He had all the power, and she had none. Finally, Mark spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "I'm going to have a word with your superiors," he said, his voice low and measured. And I'll make sure they understand exactly what you did here. What you've done to this airline's reputation. What you've done to me." Caitlin's stomach churned. She didn't need him to tell her what that would mean. It meant her job, her career, everything she had worked for, was at risk. And it was all because she had allowed herself to be blinded by her own prejudices, her own narrow viewpoint. She had let herself get caught up in something that didn't matter. And now she would pay for it. "You'll regret this," Mark said finally, his words almost too quiet to hear. "But I hope you learn from it, because there's no turning back." As Caitlin stood there, knowing there was nothing she could say or do to change the course of events, she realized that Mark wasn't just her customer. He was the one who held the keys to her future, and she had just handed him the power to take everything away. The tension that had once hung in the air now felt like a heavy silence, one that stretched endlessly. Caitlin remained standing near the gate, her gaze fixed on the floor. She could barely bring herself to meet Mark's eyes. The reality of her situation had sunk in, and the weight of it was crushing. Her body felt like it was made of lead, and her thoughts were a jumble of confusion, regret, and disbelief. She had made a choice, a mistake, and now she was facing the consequences. Mark had already walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance, but Caitlin didn't move. She didn't know if she could. Her world felt like it was spinning out of control. In the span of a few minutes, her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for seemed to be slipping through her fingers. There was nothing she could do to take back the words she had said or the way she had treated Mark. The damage was done, and the ramifications of her actions were beginning to unfold. As the minutes dragged on, Caitlin finally mustered the strength to look up. She glanced around the terminal, and it hit her all at once. People were still moving, still going about their business as if nothing had happened. They were oblivious to what had just transpired, to the fact that she had just thrown a man off a plane, a man who had revealed himself to be the very owner of the airline. To them, it was just another day at the airport, but to Caitlin, it felt like the world had shifted. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. She had assumed she was in control, that her authority was unquestioned. But in the end, it was her own biases, her own narrow viewpoint, that had led her to make a decision that was not just wrong but reckless. And now, as she stood there, the reality of what she had done started to crystallize in her mind. She had humiliated herself in front of everyone, and worse, she had damaged the very organization she had worked so hard for. Caitlin's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She didn't know who to call first. Her manager? Human resources? What could she say? How could she explain what had just happened? There was no simple way to justify what she had done. She had acted impulsively, without thinking, without considering the full consequences of her actions. And now there was no way to undo it. But as she stood there, lost in her thoughts, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her supervisor, asking her to meet in the office after her shift. Caitlin felt her stomach drop. She knew what this was about. Mark had likely already spoken to someone higher up, and now the repercussions were about to hit. She had no idea what the fallout would be, but she knew it wouldn't be good. With a deep breath, Caitlin walked slowly to the back office. Every step felt like a countdown to the inevitable. She had no idea what awaited her, but she couldn't avoid it any longer. Her shift was over, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. The office door opened, and Caitlin stepped inside. Her supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Susan, was already sitting at her desk. There was no warmth in her gaze, no sign of sympathy. The tension in the room was palpable. Caitlin could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for it. "Caitlin," Susan said, her voice cold, "I've just received a report about what happened at the gate. I've been informed that you asked a passenger to leave because of his hat." Caitlin's throat went dry. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. She simply nodded, her face flushed with shame. "You know the company's policy on political statements," Susan continued, "but I also know that we don't take these kinds of decisions lightly. We don't ask passengers to leave unless it's absolutely necessary." I thought it was necessary, Caitlin stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. He was making people uncomfortable. The hat, it was too much. Couldn't let it slide. Susan's gaze hardened. I understand that you were doing your job, but you also need to understand that there are consequences for acting impulsively. You've just made an enemy of the one person who could have supported you in your career. Caitlin's breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of her mistake crushing her chest. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't know who he was. Mark Thompson, Susan said, her voice quieter now. He's the owner of this airline, and he's made it very clear that he doesn't take this kind of behavior lightly. He's already made a report to the board. You've embarrassed yourself, and you've embarrassed this company. Caitlin's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. I didn't mean to, she said, her voice cracking. I just thought it was the right thing to do. I thought I was helping. You thought you were helping? Susan repeated, her voice sharp. You thought that by enforcing a personal bias, you were helping? Caitlin, this isn't about your opinion. This is about professionalism, and you failed at that. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I made a mistake. Susan sighed, standing up from her desk. This isn't about an apology, Caitlin. It's about understanding the bigger picture. You can't let personal feelings get in the way of your job. And now you'll have to face the consequences of that. Caitlin nodded, tears streaming down her face. She knew what was coming. She had lost everything, and there was no easy way to fix it. But there was one thing she was sure of. She would never make this mistake again.